No disrespect, Max. You're not gonna lay a glove on me.
5 years ago, Conor McGregor left the arena on a stretcher with a shattered leg and a titanium rod waiting to be implanted. Now, he's walking back into that same octagon to face Max Holloway, a fighter who spent those same years doing exactly what champions are supposed to do, staying active, sharpening his skills, and beating elite competition. That 5-year gap tells the entire story. While Holloway kept building one of the greatest careers the featherweight division has ever seen, McGregor's journey looked very different. Recovering from a devastating injury, expanding businesses, and constantly making headlines outside the cage, he became one of the biggest names in sports without throwing a single punch inside the octagon. Their first meeting back in 2013 hardly looked historic. Both men fought on the prelims, long before either became a global superstar. McGregor won that night, but over a decade later, everything has changed. This isn't about settling an old score. It's about answering a much bigger question. Has the sport moved on without Conor McGregor, or does he still belong among the very best? The turning point came at UFC 264 against Dustin Poirier. At the end of the opening round, McGregor's left tibia and fibula snapped, ending the fight in one of the most shocking injuries the sport had ever seen. His team later revealed that stress fractures had already developed during training camp, and the final checked kick only completed the break. The recovery was brutal, but McGregor stayed optimistic. Surgeons inserted a titanium rod through his leg, and he promised he'd be back stronger than ever. At first, it sounded like just another setback in the career of a fighter who had overcome impossible odds before. But those weeks slowly turned into months. And eventually years. While the world waited for his return, McGregor's life kept moving. His business empire expanded, his public profile grew even bigger, and he remained one of the UFC's biggest attractions despite not fighting. Every few months, he talked about coming back, insisting he felt stronger than ever. Yet the comeback never seemed to materialize. The closest it came was a long-awaited fight with Michael Chandler. After months of promotion, the event suddenly fell apart following a toe injury, delaying his return once again. By then, the biggest question wasn't whether McGregor's leg had healed, it clearly had. The real question was whether 5 years away from elite competition had taken away the timing, sharpness, and instincts that only real fights can preserve. Meanwhile, Max Holloway never stopped evolving. When they first met in Boston back in 2013, neither man was a champion. McGregor was only 2 fights into his UFC career, while Holloway was still a young prospect trying to find his place.
Have more money than I know what to do with, and have a great life for my kids, my grandkids. My name is Conor McGregor. I'm a professional MMA fighter. My dream is to be world lightweight champion in the UFC.
The Irish crowd turned the arena into McGregor's home turf, and he delivered with a dominant unanimous decision victory. What many fans don't realize is that McGregor fought much of that bout with a torn ACL, making the performance even more remarkable. Back then, it was simply another win. Today, it has become one of the most important fights either man's career has ever led to. During their first meeting in 2013, McGregor wasn't fighting at full strength. Midway through the second round, he tore his ACL while attempting a takedown. Despite the injury, he adjusted his approach, controlled the remainder of the fight, and earned a unanimous decision victory. Holloway also entered the bout dealing with an ankle injury, meaning both young prospects fought through pain before either had become a household name. More than a decade later, McGregor still points back to that night as proof that he can beat Holloway again. But the sport has changed, and so have the fighters. After losing to McGregor, Holloway transformed into one of the greatest featherweights in UFC history. He put together a remarkable 13-fight winning streak, captured the interim featherweight title, then traveled to Brazil and defeated Jose Aldo to become the undisputed champion. Months later, he repeated the feat, proving the first victory was no fluke. His reign didn't stop there. Holloway defended the title against elite contenders, overwhelmed some of the division's toughest names, and established himself as the most relentless striker at 145 pounds. Even after losing the championship, he rebuilt his momentum with victories over top-ranked opponents and reminded everyone why he remained one of the sport's elite. Then came another unforgettable moment. Moving up to lightweight for the BMF title, Holloway produced one of the most iconic finishes in UFC history, knocking out Justin Gaethje in the final seconds of a fight he had already dominated. It was another chapter in a career built on consistency, durability, and world-class striking. By the time this rematch arrives, Holloway owns some of the greatest striking records the UFC has ever seen. He holds the records for the most significant strikes landed and the most total strikes in promotional history. He also leads the featherweight division in wins, longest winning streak, finishes, and knockout victories. His performance against Calvin Kattar, where he landed a record-breaking number of strikes over 5 rounds, remains one of the most dominant displays the sport has ever witnessed. The 21-year-old prospect McGregor defeated in Boston no longer exists. Standing across from him now is a seasoned champion with one of the deepest resumes in MMA history. Still, McGregor brings a weapon that has changed fights throughout his career, his devastating left hand. One perfectly timed shot has ended countless nights early, and even after years away from competition, that power remains impossible to ignore. He'll also enter the fight as the naturally bigger man, while Holloway makes his welterweight debut, leaving questions about how the added weight could affect his performance. But Holloway's style has always been built to test opponents over time. He fights at a relentless pace, mixing body shots, jabs, and combinations while maintaining pressure from the opening bell until the final round. His output barely drops, even deep into championship fights, forcing opponents to match a pace very few can survive. That creates a fascinating clash of styles. McGregor is most dangerous when he has space to read his opponent and land clean counters. Holloway does everything he can to deny that space, constantly pushing forward and forcing exchanges until the pressure becomes overwhelming. One factor could still shape the outcome. For most of his career, Holloway was known for having one of the toughest chins in UFC history, rarely even being knocked down. But after years of wars inside the octagon, many are beginning to wonder whether that legendary durability can still withstand the kind of power McGregor carries in his left hand. For most of his UFC career, Max Holloway seemed almost impossible to stop. He survived brutal battles against Jose Aldo, Brian Ortega, Dustin Poirier, Alexander Volkanovski, and Justin Gaethje without ever being knocked out. That finally changed at UFC 308, where Ilia Topuria became the first fighter to finish Holloway with strikes inside the octagon. It was a historic moment and the first real sign that even Holloway's legendary durability had its limits. Recent fights have also shown that he can be hurt by the right shot, making this rematch even more intriguing against one of the hardest punchers the sport has ever seen. McGregor's greatest weapon has always been his explosive power. Throughout his career, one perfectly timed left hand has been enough to change the outcome of a fight in an instant. He'll also enter this contest as the naturally bigger athlete, while Holloway competes at welterweight for the first time. Holloway, however, has built his success in a completely different way. He overwhelms opponents with relentless pressure, constant movement, and an incredible volume of strikes that rarely slows from the opening round to the final bell. It's a style that forces opponents to fight at his pace rather than their own. That contrast makes this rematch so compelling. One fighter looks for a single fight-ending shot, while the other relies on pressure, pace, and consistency over every round. Their first meeting took place more than 13 years ago on the preliminary card in Boston, when both were young prospects searching for their breakthrough. Since then, their careers have taken remarkably different paths. Holloway grew into one of the most accomplished featherweights in UFC history, collecting championship victories and setting records that may stand for years. McGregor became the sport's biggest global superstar, capturing titles in 2 weight classes before a devastating leg injury halted his career at its peak. Now their paths cross again. For McGregor, this fight represents the opportunity to complete one of the most remarkable comebacks in MMA history after years away from competition. For Holloway, it's another chance to strengthen an already legendary legacy against the man who handed him one of the earliest defeats of his career. More than a decade after sharing the octagon for the first time, both men return under completely different circumstances, but with far more at stake than ever before. On July 11th, the questions that have followed both fighters for years will finally be answered inside the octagon.